then eventually you kind of collapse into that, and that's the first jhana in that system. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, it's difficult. The Wystan helped me. It's like, let me try a few things. Oh, that one works way better. And then I go back to fussing and lose momentum. So it's some optimal mix of experimentation.
Yeah, I mean, and there is like how much proactive versus receptive effort. Stephen talks about it that way. It's like, I mean, yeah, we'll talk about this more in a bit. Yeah.
We were probably almost.
Yeah, a couple minutes.
Yes.
Yeah, you read on Monday.
7:30. No, 7:28. What does it need? Oh yes. We'll also record audio separately, just in case.
Okay. Yeah.
Hello, hello. Welcome, welcome. Yeah, feel free to grab a seat anywhere. Cool. Can I take a picture of you guys? Anybody who doesn't want to be in the picture? Or all good? Okay. Excellent. Yeah, I just like to document random moments and random moments. Thank you, thank you. Yeah, I think we're gonna get started in like 30 seconds or so as soon as like Wystan comes over. But yeah, thank you so much for coming over. It's gonna be interesting. What you're seeing right now, it's 7-dimensional objects embedded in a 12-dimensional space being projected onto a 3-dimensional space with them trying to essentially like synchronize their projections. And you can see kind of like how they get aligned if I turn the speed all the way down. I swear this is like somewhat connected to meditation, but the connection will become clear after I give my talk. But meanwhile, please enjoy these trippy visuals and see if does this ring a bell? Have you experienced something like this? Is this or is this totally new kind of experience for you guys? Okay, okay.
I see this every night.
Right? You're one of those. I mean, the thing is like. Right, if you're like a very high if you're a 3-dimensional object and you find another 3-dimensional object, but you're both in a very, very high dimensional space, what's interesting is like how you will look to each other generically will actually be like a point. Like we tend to think of like oh, what would like the shadow be of like, an object in high dimensions on this dimension? Like for almost all the cases, it actually just looks like it's like a point, which is kind of like hard to get an intuition for, but like this is something that you can actually see here that like, you see as I increase the dimension in which these objects are embedded, there's still, in this case, let's say there's still cubes, but like as I'm increasing the number of dimensions, the shadow of these cubes actually start to become like points. And I swear, these are still cubes. They're just like, they look very, very, very small, just because their shadow is like that and that's just how high dimensions work. But it's kind of incumbent on us to actually develop an intuition for how high dimensions work. Assuming the universe is is actually like that, and we're living in a tiny, tiny 3-dimensional surface that we pretend is all of reality. Yes, question.
Can you define what you mean by 12 dimensions?
Yeah, I mean, like the simplest example is like I'll start with a simple example, which is like, okay, right now I have like 2-dimensional objects, which are like squares, inhabiting 3 dimensions, and being projected, in this case, let's say into 2 dimensions. So it's kind of like there's a bunch of squares in space, and they're like at random orientations to begin with. And then what I'm doing is kind of like, oh, there's like a light, and I'm casting a shadow, right? And there's like the question of like, okay, if instead of being in 3 dimensions, if these squares were like on 20 dimensions, you like added additional dimensions of depth, how would the shadows like start to look like? And you will see like, you know, in 2 dimensions, of course, they look like squares, right? Like if you have like 2-dimensional squares and you just like project them onto 2 dimensions, they look exactly the same. If you put them in 3D, you see they can kind of like look sideways, right? Like you can take a square and like if you paint it kind of like sideways, like the shadow will be very thin, right? So there's like, as you increase more dimensions, the number of ways in which the shadow becomes like thin and small increases. There's like more ways for the shadow to become like, oh, very, very, just like most of the objects when they're in high dimensions, you're looking at them from like the side, like rather than like facing front. Like it's really rare to actually face an object directly. And so this is like 4 dimensions, 5. And you see as I increase the number of dimensions, it becomes very needle-like and very point-like. But anyway, this is just kind of the pretty visuals preamble, the trailer before the movie. I think it's, 7 a little bit past 7:30. So yeah, let's get started.
Okay. How are folks feeling temperature-wise? Should we leave the door open to get ventilation in here? Yeah? Noise coming in, not too bad? Okay. We set to record?
Yeah, it's recording and recording the audio.
Okay.
Awesome.
So thank you very much, everybody, for coming to this presentation. The program for the evening, I'm going to yap for a bit about traditional Buddhist perspectives on the titular topics, consciousness and awakening. And then I'm going to lead us through a couple of guided exercises as we move through the topics. And then I'm going to hand it off to Andrés to give a more contemporary scientific perspective and present some of QRI's latest research. And then we'll open it up afterwards for Q&A. Folks everybody been to the bathroom, got water, everybody comfortable? All right. So, why be interested in this at all? Why be interested in awakening, in consciousness? For the Buddha, not that guy actually, that's Buddhai, that's a Chinese monk, semi-historical. Often mistaken for the historical Buddha, no. The Indian guy, North Indian guy, Siddhartha Gautama, 2,500 years ago, he set out, left his wife and child to, in his own words, find an end to birth, aging, sickness, old age, and death. Seeing around him the condition of sentient beings, knowing himself subject to the same, that everyone around him, even though no matter how much wealth, no matter how much power, no matter what conditions one can amass to oneself, he saw those around him and knew for himself that all of that would change, all of it would vanish, and whatever he could acquire would eventually depart from him, even his own body and mind. And as for many people up to today, that kind of bothered him. Everything that I can grasp and hold on to, one, it doesn't lastingly satisfy if one pays close attention, and 2, even if one does manage to hold and grasp onto things, eventually they will change and vanish. If not before the time of death, then certainly then. And also embedded at the time in a grander cosmological scheme, this was understood and is still in Buddha Dharma as an endless cycle. And it's not only one life, it's endlessly into the past and potentially endlessly into the future. Whether you buy into that cosmological scheme or not, that is how it is traditionally understood, and that's certainly how he saw it. So, with that kind of grand scope, he set out to find, is there an end of dukkha, what he called dukkha, what's usually translated as suffering? Is there an end to suffering in this life, and also to put an end to that constant and endless cycle of birth, aging, sickness, old age, and death? Resisting what one doesn't want, trying to grasp and hold on to what one does want. And this he discovered through, at first, leaving his wife and newborn child, pretty radical move, best deadbeat dad of all time. It's okay, his son later took ordination and attained full awakening. So, deadbeat dad, then best dad. Not too bad if your child attains full awakening. By studying with some of the eminent teachers of his time, he entered into extremely refined states of consciousness that they were teaching at the time as the epitome and the pinnacle of freedom that would lead to lasting freedom, not only in life, but after life. And he integrated this into his own system as the formless jhanas. Maybe you've heard of the jhanas. So he was learning from teachers who were active at the time. You could withdraw the senses and enter into very refined formless states of consciousness in which the body is gone, sensation is gone, the sense of self is temporarily suspended, and one is immersed in very refined states. And there's practically no discernible suffering in those states, and that was understood to be liberation in this life and also thereafter. But he wasn't satisfied, even mastering those states to the point where those teachers invited him to become co-teachers with them and take leadership of their communities. All of those states necessarily came to an end. They were born of causes and conditions, and when those causes and conditions no longer obtained, the states ceased, and the churn of dissatisfaction would begin again. So, not finding satisfaction and happiness in a worldly life, he was set up to take leadership in the kind of tribal confederacy of which his father was a leading aristocratic member. Letting that go. Also, he didn't find anything satisfactory in any of the spiritual teachings which were available at the time. And so he set out taking up all kinds of brutal ascetic practices, starving himself, holding his breath until he turned all kinds of shades of color and felt immense pain. Not lying down, exposing himself to the elements. Every kind of ascetic practice that was available at the time, he tried it, brought it to its utmost, and still, just like these refined states of meditation, it didn't bring him the release that he was looking for. So, abandoning, finding that was not bringing him the liberation that he sought, he journeyed and realized that he needed a middle way between kind of indulgence in the senses, the kind of pushing and pulling against sensory objects that most of us are engaged in quite a lot of the time, and also not starving or abusing the system, trying to push away and escape that cycle through kind of brute force. What he hit upon was a memory of himself as a young child when, quite relaxed, he sat underneath in the shade of a tree watching farmers at work, and he entered into what he later discovered was the first jhana. Maybe you've also heard of this, that was filled with a kind of pleasure and a rapture that was not bound up or conditioned based on sensory impressions, food, sight, sound. And intuition had it for him at that point that this might be the way to awakening, actually. That here is a pleasure and a rapture that is wholesome, that is not dependent on getting and holding on to something outside of myself. Maybe that is the way to awakening. And so he decided to try it. And so he wandered to a place that was, as he said, fit for striving, under what would become known as the Bodhi tree, Bodhi awakening, where he would attain awakening, and declared to himself, I will sit here on this very spot, and I will not rise until I have attained full awakening, or I die. Right here. Determined guy. And as the legend goes, that very night, after sitting motionless, he attained what he had sought. He saw the construction, the arising and passing away of all elements of his own experience, realized the cause of suffering, realized the cessation of suffering, and realized the path to the cessation of suffering. What he would then teach to some of his fellows as the Four Noble Truths. You may have heard of them. Dukkha, suffering. First, there is dukkha. Sometimes translated as, life is suffering. It's just the fact of dukkha. There is birth, sickness, old age, and death on a physical level. We're embodied organisms. All of this is subject to change and decay. Bummer. That's if you're familiar with Lee Brasington, one of my teachers, he likes to translate dukkha as bummer. There are just some unavoidable bummers. Pain, sickness, old age, and death being among them. But there's also, apart from raw, unpleasant sensory stimulus, there's also all of the secondary reactivity that we layer on top of our embodied experience. mental aversion, craving and clinging, wanting what's not present and not wanting what is present. And it's really that secondary layer of mental reactivity that is responsible for the vast, vast majority of the suffering that brings most of us to practice, or most of us to interest in practice. Or we hear about awakening, freedom from suffering. What does that really mean? Most of us get really interested in that. Certainly true for me, because of suffering, and that secondary layer of mental reactivity. And the cause of suffering, the second of the four noble truths that he realized, is what he called tanha, which literally means thirst, often translated in English as craving. Craving for becoming, craving to continue, to be, to become. Also craving for sense objects, craving for delightful sights, delightful sounds, delightful tactile sensations, which creates a kind of restlessness in the system, an agitation that must be satiated. You know, everyone here familiar with the sensation of thirst? It's aptly aptly called this tanha that is embodied and gives rise to the dissatisfaction with the present contents of experience. That is the cause of dukkha. Not only as he understood it, not only the cause of the suffering in the present life, but also the fuel that keeps the cycle going from life to life, that keeps our mental continua coming back, yearning, reaching into the next moment, and appropriating what he called the aggregates: form, feeling, mental perception, mental formations, and consciousness. And then he realized the cessation of dukkha, which is the cessation of that very craving, the cessation of that thirst. When that is abandoned, not only does that reactivity cease, but also the identification with this changing process of mind and body that is part and parcel of that thirst, the thirst for becoming, the thirst to be, the thirst to identify. That ceases. And then he found the path to that. Having realized it himself, he realized a path of training that he could teach to others, that they might come to the same kind of freedom that he did. So, having said all that, what you find in the early tradition, and the best of all of the traditions in Buddha Dharma, is a very practical orientation. The Buddha declared that all he taught was dukkha and dukkha nirodha, suffering and the end of suffering. Many passages in the early tradition, and in my opinion, the best that continued and evolved, is not so much concerned with metaphysical or ontological speculation. Not that those things are bad in themselves, but they don't conduce within the limited time that we have to actually realizing this for ourselves. What makes the difference is using whatever conceptual scaffolding is kind of minimally necessary, and then taking the plunge and actually seeing and releasing that thirst, and realizing the cessation of dukkha, and letting go of the identification that fuels and is reciprocally conditioning with that craving. There's lots of schemes, some of them I've already mentioned, and scaffolding within the early Buddhist tradition, and they're kind of different ways to slice the problem. I've mentioned some of them already. There's the 5 aggregates. Maybe you've encountered them before. The skandhas. And this is kind of inclusive and a way to divide pragmatically experience. There's form, internal and external. Visual objects, things that offer resistance, both bodily and visual. That's form. And all of these are what we cling to. That's kind of the practical upshot of these categories. This is what we cling to, what we crave, and what we base our sense of self on. Whether it's what we have and can appropriate externally in terms of form, or the solidity of our own bodies. And then there's feeling, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So this isn't something as elaborated as emotion. It's more on the raw level of, does this feel good, unpleasant, or neutral? And then there's perception, the process of dividing up the field of experience into differentiated objects. This is a phone, that's a pillar, that's a person. That's what is known as perception in the scheme of the 5 aggregates. And mental formations, that's kind of all of the other mental activity, intention, memory, everything that doesn't fit into the other categories, all of the mental activity, that's under mental formation. And then consciousness, which is kind of a funny translation, is vijnana, which one etymology has it as a kind of divided knowing. V, that's the prefix in that word, and then jnana. V is kind of privative or separating, and then jnana is consciousness, so divided knowing. And in the scheme of where consciousness as such is defined in the early tradition, it's as these 6 senses. The 5 we're normally familiar with, as well as the mind. So there are 6 sense bases: eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. 6 sense objects, so the respective objects to which those senses refer. And then the consciousnesses, the kind of interplay between the object and the sense base. There you have the sense consciousness. And that is kind of exhaustive. So whether you classify experience in terms of the aggregates or the 6 sense bases, the craving and clinging and identification is what has to be seen through and released. And the Buddha and the early monastic community that grew up around him devised a number of ingenious methods for seeing clearly the changing nature of mind and body, to bringing the mind and body into a calm and collected state, opening the heart, releasing everything that prevents a kind of wholesome absorption, like the jhanas. And then on the basis of that, seeing through the changing aggregates of experience, seeing through the nature of consciousness, to cut through the craving that binds us to identification, craving and clinging, moment after moment. Some of the most celebrated and used to this day frameworks for approaching this kind of liberating insight are what are known as the 3 characteristics. And at this point, I will stop speaking so quickly and lead us in a guided exercise so that we can actually get into contact and get a feeling for what this is actually pointing to in our own experience. So if you're not already, I invite you to take a comfortable posture. You don't mind not moving in for the next, we're not going to go too long, maybe somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes. Something alert, upright, stable, relaxed, that you won't need to fidget or move in. You can close your eyes for now. And draw your awareness in to the space of the body. The contact that it's making with whatever you're seated on. Here we're getting in touch with form and feeling. The form of the body. The contact it's making with tactile objects. The process of respiration, the rise and fall of the abdomen. Any other sensations throughout the whole body that you may notice. And for every sensation of form, it will either be pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. our natural inclination is to desire the pleasant and flinch away from the unpleasant. So without judging or attempting to change anything, just notice in your perception of form and of feeling. Is it pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, a mix? And do you notice any inclination or leaning within your mind to grasp, to hold on to want to increase, to pull or push away from something that's unpleasant? And here, in the perception of form and feeling, the body, we can begin to notice the most obvious of the three characteristics, that for whatever sensation there is, it doesn't last. If we really look, it's changing moment to moment. What may appear solid and stable actually doesn't stay the same from one instant to the next. Now open your eyes and just stare straight in front of you as though you're looking through the world, or your eyes are fixed at an imaginary point on the horizon. And then let your gaze defocus so you're aware of the whole visual field at once. And notice if your mind is categorizing, labeling, picking things out as this or that. What is the visual field really? There's shape and light, but there's a function of the mind that is designating. Pillar, chair, person. And the visual field too, though it may be subtler, doesn't stay the same at all, one moment to the next. If you move your eyes, the whole field changes. Even gazing fixed at one point, still, there's subtler impermanence that can be noticed. And mental formation, if there's a stream of intention arising, thoughts, imaginings, desires, that too changing moment to moment. And consciousness. Independence on a functioning sense organ and the presence of an object. There is this knowing. So these 5 aggregates, these heaps, bundles, they change from one minute to the next, one moment to the next. And it's on the basis of this, of our sensory experience, that we appropriate, grasp, cling, and crave to objects of experience, to configurations of our mind and body. And it's on the basis of this sensory arrangement that we create a sense of I, a sense of me, a sense of mine, a sense of a here, a sense of a there. But through attending to themes like impermanence within perception, you can begin to destabilize, upset the patterns of craving and clinging and grasping, to see through the nature of one's own mind, to interrupt that cycle. And all of this changing sensation, sight, sound, feeling, when we cling and crave and grasp and push and pull, it's dukkha, it's unsatisfactory. And if we look closely, we won't ever find a pearl or a point or a location, a stable basis for identity. Something we can point to and say, this I truly am. Only fluctuating sensation. Only these aggregates. Which on the basis of our craving and clinging and ideation, we appropriate me, as mine. But seeing through persistently enough, taking up these themes of impermanence, of the absence of any selfhood, seeing the unsatisfactory nature of impermanent sensation, and the frustration and clinging and craving, we can release that very craving and clinging and realize the end of suffering in this very body and mind. And when none of these aggregates are appropriated as me or mine, the self that seems to be born, that ages, that gets sick, that dies, the notion of a being also ceases when that appropriation ceases. Take home. Form, feeling, perception, mental formation, consciousness, 6 senses, 3 characteristics. To realize freedom in this life. More than enough scaffolding to go on. We'll end the verbose guided practice there. You could open your eyes if you had them closed and reorient to the space around. So that's the perspective from the early tradition. As Buddha Dharma grew and flourished and spread, there were some developments, some new perspectives, but that's really the foundation. You know, it's in this constant stream of sensation that we confuse, identify, crave, and cling, and that's the basis of our suffering. But through calming and collecting the mind, and through seeing through the nature of consciousness, we can let go of that craving and clinging and mistaken identification, and realize freedom from the suffering attendant upon identifying with these changing aggregates. So the early tradition is mainly concerned with and is operating from the perspective of the problem. Here we are, this like compounded world of form and shape and color and sight and sound and me and stuff. I can't hold on to what I want, and I can't avoid what I don't want. Fuck. I want out. I want out. This game sucks. I don't want to play anymore. Let me out. Reasonable. The development of the tradition, one way of looking at it is that a lot of it is framed from the perspective of freedom that is realized, the perspective of awakening itself. When one isn't appropriating the aggregates, when one isn't craving or clinging to ephemeral, conditional, sensory phenomena. And then what can open is a recognition that, hold on a second, and this is also present in the early tradition, that what is this actually? Everything that appears. Where is all of this happening? If we look, try to find a border or a boundary between the self and the world, between the mind and objects, there can dawn a recognition that everything that appears within consciousness is consciousness itself. That consciousness and its appearances are non-dual. Like a mirror upon which many reflections pass, but what appears is inseparable from the surface of the mirror. And it's as though a portion of the mirror were trying to like grasp and manipulate the passing reflections in the mirror, and never recognizing that the nature of the mirror itself is reflecting and fine, even as things pass through it. Clumsy metaphor. But when that craving and clinging ceases, what the Buddha referred to as nirvana, or nibbana in Pali, the extinguishment of the flame, the fire of craving and aversion, wasn't given, it's described negatively, because the Buddha didn't want to set up another thing for people to grasp at. But it's described as the supreme, the highest happiness. When consciousness doesn't grasp, doesn't push, doesn't pull, the natural result from the release of all of that craving and clinging and appropriation and kind of compacting of self and phenomena, and the duality, the split, the bifurcation between self and world, self and other, yes and no. What dawns is bliss, is peace, is freedom, is open space. And in later tradition, that's kind of taken as the basis, is, wait a second, if you just recognize the nature of your own mind, of consciousness itself, as this empty theater, which when you don't push and don't pull, is a miraculous, spontaneous display. That is totally sufficient in itself, doesn't require anything to be completely content. This is sometimes referred to as Tathagata, usually rendered as Buddha nature. So the awakening that one seeks, it doesn't lie outside of oneself. It isn't anywhere distant. It's simply the recognition of the nature of one's own mind as Buddha, as awake. That's what Buddha means, literally, awake. So this wakeful field in which and as which things appear, when the craving and clinging ceases, all good. And different methods and philosophies and practice traditions developed from that kind of more direct, immediate recognition. Zen in East Asia, Dzogchen, Mahamudra in Tibet. But as I've practiced and experienced, these are two ways of talking about one and the same realization. Whether you're framing it from the perspective of the problem and what needs to be abandoned, or whether you're speaking about it as what needs to be realized and the experience of the result. Where are we at time-wise?
Yeah, 8 to 10.
So, yeah, 5 minutes and then I'll hand it off. Let's do another short guided thing. So like before, this time we're going to keep our eyes open. Gaze unfocused in front of you, as though through the world. And ask yourself, where? Where am I? If you notice that your mind is landing on or referring to some sensation in the body or pinging off of space, or landing in thought and concocting an explanation, just come back to the question. Where am I? You could even shorten it just to where. Allow yourself not to know and not to land on any conclusion. Where is this happening? Sight, sound, sensation? Really look. Where is this? it there. Right then, where are you when I clap my hands? In the instant of the sound.
Thank you, Wystan. So I'm sure that clarified all of your questions. I think I probably don't need to go on to the second part. But yeah, I mean, and there's going to be a little bit of time at the end for questions, and also, well, I guess if there's like any burning questions right now, like also like feel free to.
Yeah, structure's pretty loose.
Yeah, yeah. Otherwise, I'm very happy to like jump into like the presentation. I mean, like the main thing I want to kind of like actually clarify. I mean, because everything that we just heard, there's an interesting kind of like tension between, hey, are these like meditation instructions, or are these kind of like metaphysical claims, or is it maybe like the negation of kind of like metaphysical claims, or stepping around metaphysics, or trying to get to the core? What exactly are we doing? I think one frame that we have talked about at the Qualia Research Institute for some time that I think is like really clarifying, perhaps. And actually, I don't have it as a slide, but this refers essentially to the same thing. It's the difference between recipe and review. Where like if you bake a cake, where like there is a sense in which the instructions of how to bake a cake are not the same as, okay, like the review somebody who, is a judge of various cakes would actually write. Where like the instructions, it gives information about the temperature, the materials, the process. The review tells you, hey, like the mouth feel, how sugary it feels, how does it make you feel afterwards? Does it make you sick in the stomach? The review is, in a sense, pointing at kind of like the phenomenological effects, right? Like that, what kind of like fireworks does this produce? What kind of results do you get? The recipe is, in some sense, kind of this like opaque prompt. I mean, it is this sequence of like small instructions that give rise to something. Now, in meditation, I think like kind of like getting really clear about this distinction is like really conceptually clarifying, right? Because if you think, okay, like if we go to like a, like random spiritual community, you join in for kind of like the group meditation of the day, and they say, well, today I'm gonna explain how we are all beings of light, right? And we are all in an ocean of love, right? What am I doing here? I mean, there's like a sense in which you may think, well, I'm actually, giving you the truth of the matter, like the download. Hey, like I talked to God, and like, hey, the truth is everything is love, right? Like, and we live in an ocean of love. Another lens is like I'm actually kind of like prompting your mind to see your experience, to see reality in a certain way that will catalyze specific effects. Now, it's not exactly necessarily kind of like baking a cake. I'm not giving you like, okay, like do these, except that, of course, there's like meditation techniques that are like very, very technical and precise like that. But the recipe is a little bit more loose, and a lot of like what I'm actually doing is kind of like loading up, like ontologies, reference, feelings, and then have you work with them. And I think like one good kind of like metaphor that is much more, I suppose, like contemporary now is the concept of like prompting. Like I guess like nowadays there's a lot of people who call themselves prompt engineers, and no shit, actually it is like a very legitimate like area of research. Like how do you interact with like AI systems that are like actually like really sophisticated? There's like a lot of huge number of parameters behind them, and intricate architectures. How do you interface with them to kind of get the best out of them, right? And to a large extent, at least it's my experience, a lot of people who kind of like underestimate the power of AI, it's really just because they're not exploring or like, playing with or kind of really putting themselves out there to kind of like challenge the technology and see like, hey, what is it capable of doing, right? Like if all you do with ChatGPT or Claude or Grok or whatever it may be, is ask for recipes or like ask for directions or like, okay, like write me an email or something like that, you're not really kind of like tapping into the interesting capabilities here, right? Like, but you like really challenge it, right? Like you pose it like metaphysical questions, like difficult ethical questions, coding questions and so on. You can push it to the limit and you realize like, oh my gosh, there was actually this like vast amount of like hidden structure behind it, where, I mean, on the one hand, kind of like what actually comes up, is not actually the underlying structure, but is in some sense a reflection of it, right? Like, of course, like if you tell Claude, hey, like, make a website where you paint your true face or something like that. Well, it's going to completely hallucinate, right? Like it's not the case that like when Claude paints its own face, it's actually showing you its own face. But it is like showing you something about its capabilities, right? Like something about its substrate, how it processes information, how it puts features together. And I think like likewise, if you have kind of like that as a lens, it's like, okay, like these ideas of like, hey, you're made of love, like, or we're all one, or like everything is light, or like, everything is suffering, like, or there's nothing, like nothing exists. All of these, you can really think of them as kind of like ways of prompting. I mean, at least in my perspective, right? Like we are kind of this, not only like, supercomputers, we might be like something stranger, like, nonlinear optical, electromagnetic, quantum supercomputers. Like clearly, there's a lot of ways in which the richness that we don't experience in life has to do with just how narrow our prompting approaches are. Michael Levin, for those who don't know, he's a cell biologist. He's essentially been investigating very deeply how cells come together to form like collectives, and how you get like agency out of like very tiny organisms. He recently wrote this Substack post about a glossary of new terms. In general, I'm the kind of person who actually enjoys reading glossaries. I know some people like find that boring, but I actually think like it's a very effective way of getting up to speed with kind of like landscapes of knowledge. And by the way, the Quality Research Institute has a glossary. If you Google QRI glossary, that's actually one of the ways in which you can get up to speed with QRI quite quickly. But he has been kind of like thinking of his own work of like how to interface with tiny cells, tiny organisms, as kind of like bioprompting, right? Like with the way he defines this is, the ways in which biological systems signal each other in ways that hack, manipulate, or otherwise exploit the competencies of the receiver to induce complex outcomes with simple signals. And I think like that is the key, right? Like, the richness of a meditation experience is not actually, in the prompt, right? It's just how your really complex system reacts to it and how it adapts to it. Now, to maybe contextualize a little bit, I do think that, of course, like one of the biggest prompts that you can make in a sense is kind of like a theory of reality, a theory of consciousness, a theory of the world, because the moment I kind of convince you that, hey, like, the world is made of atoms and forces, or like the world is made of spirits or something like that, that is like a really powerful prompt, right? Like I'm actually convincing you that the universe has a certain nature, and your mind will tend to have like the tendency of actually just taking it and running with it, right? Like, and a lot of what happens in your experience will unfold largely because of implicit background assumptions about what you believe is true, what you believe is real, what you believe matters, what you believe is important and ethical. So of course, like, being very candid here, right? Like, of course, like by me giving you kind of like a theory of consciousness or a theory of the mind, I've got to acknowledge that this is some kind of like meta prompt in some sense, right? Like, so of course, like, at the highest levels, you always should kind of hold these lightly, right? Like don't grab a kind of like whatever QRI theory of consciousness I throw at you and say like, okay, this is the truth. It's like, well, on the one hand, it's kind of like a prompt, of course, like we're trying to figure out what the truth is. But be mindful that what you believe to be true will be constraining what is it that you can experience. Or like that's a really fascinating fact about the brain and consciousness, our experience. I would position kind of like how QRI sees the brain, the mind, consciousness, kind of like somewhere in between the space of like, Wolfram and Michael Levin. Wolfram might say something like, well, everything is computation, simple rules generate complexity, computational irreducibility is fundamental. And like QRI agrees that algorithms and computational reductions are like extremely powerful, but at least how we comprehend consciousness, how we make sense of it, we actually don't think that something kind of like conceiving the universe as a cellular automaton, it actually has like enough explanatory power to like really explain like, hey, why do we have consciousness? Why do we have like these shades of, qualia and sensations and the unity of experience? There's like still an explanatory gap. On the other hand, something beautiful, but like the work of Michael Levin, he looks into how like collectives of cells, form unified goal-directed agents. he talks about like bioelectric fields, coordinated morphogenesis, and agency as scale free, and of course, like QRI absolutely loves all of these, and especially kind of like really taking seriously what does it mean to be like one and many at the same time? Because like this is one of the crazy things that happens in biology, where like cells somehow manage to kind of like identify with an organism that is like larger than them. Now, there is a question kind of like, ontologically, right? It's like, is a cell, when it joins a bigger organism, like, is it actually kind of like becoming something larger? Or is it like we're all kind of like, the cells are tiny gears, in this gigantic machine? And, they maintain their independent identity, like the parts and the whole. In the case of QRI, and if you want to dig deeper into this, I'm not going to delve very deeply into this right now, but I've been like very busy writing Substack posts, kind of like really try to articulate this from new angles and perspectives and with novel arguments to kind of like really make it go through. We think actually like the nature of consciousness it has like really this very peculiar property, which is like many and one at the same time, right? Like you are experiencing a visual field right now, which in some sense it is one visual field, right? Like the universe has this kind of like partition where like I don't have access to you guys' visual fields right now, right? There's a special connection that exists between the left side and right side of my visual field that is definitely not shared between the left side of my visual field and you guys' left side of your visual field. There's like some boundary that is like containing all the information inside me that is not actually bridging with other people. But then within me, it is very strange that, okay, yeah, it is one visual field, but it contains a lot of pieces of information at once, like all of these different shades of experience, textures, the feeling of movement, the sense of personalities that I see around me. All of that seems to be kind of like happening all at once. And, if you take seriously, the existence of consciousness and its properties, it very much like challenges at least like some naive assumptions about what reality must be. Now, I'm not saying that, we have figured out what reality is. All that I really can say is that we can rigorously at least discard some a little bit more kind of like simplified or naive conceptions of reality. For one, I am very confident that the universe is not just a cellular automaton of the kind of, for example, Conway's Game of Life, right? Because in Conway's Game of Life, where you have kind of a universal space in the Newtonian sense, where like there's like a universal kind of plane of simultaneity, and there's a universal time. Everything just advances at once, even that alone is kind of like non-physical, it kind of like violates relativity. There's like a bigger problem with this, which is that in a cellular automaton like Conway's Game of Life, whatever pattern arises in it will always, and by necessity, be exactly the same as the sum of its parts. Where like, if you want to predict what's going to happen in a patch of Conway's Game of Life, all you need to do is like look at the individual cells and their neighborhoods, where like there's no point where you have to kind of like consider a very large pattern and think, okay, how will this whole pattern as a whole evolve as a unit? Like that just doesn't happen, right? Like it's always just completely bottom up. By specification, by definition and construction, a cellular automaton of that type is such that like the sum is always, the whole is always exactly the sum of the parts. But that doesn't seem to be the case with consciousness. Like precisely, for example, the unification of your visual field, it is like one of these strange cases where you have like many things and one thing simultaneously, and where the whole is actually providing some kind of like causal effect on reality that it doesn't seem to be reducible to the parts. Now, I say this because even actually kind of like starting to kind of like, break the matrix as it were, and kind of like questioning your background assumptions about reality. Like, if you think reality is just a gigantic cellular automaton, that itself will kind of like be playing in the background as a kind of like constraining prompt in like what kind of like effects you may have in meditation, on psychedelics, how you might explore your own mind, how you might make sense of yourself. So I think it's actually like really psychoactive, like to actually like do philosophy of mind like really seriously, because it opens you up to like, okay, what on earth are we actually on, right? Just as Wystan was kind of like hinting at.
Really quick.
Yeah, very quick.
I was quite curious about your kind of history and your North Star, because on the one hand, you were talking about Buddhism.
Yeah.
We're back there again.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, you're talking about debating other non-Buddhist philosophers, to my knowledge, Wolfram and Michael Lovin.
Yes.
And defining yourselves in their frame. So
Yeah.
I was curious.
Well,
where did you start and where do you want to go?
Yeah. I mean, like the overall theme, I mean, really is just like how we can make sense of meditation as a kind of like a prompting mechanism, and like in what way actually we might be like subtly prompting ourselves without even realizing it, and also like what kind of thing like are we actually such that like if you have like maybe a more like narrow conception or more superficial conception of what you might have, like in what ways like that may be like narrowing down what you experience or like how you may unfold. I don't know if that answers your question, but I mean, hopefully the rest of the slides will
Got it.
maybe.
And then just as a brief follow-up, do you kind of feel that the Buddhist explanation was not satisfactory, or that there's no other satisfactory model, or?
Yeah. I mean, I am of the mind that I define myself as an epistemological optimist in that like I really do think that we can find out about the truth of the universe. I'm very optimistic about that. I put a lot of energy in it, and my general lens is that a lot of like spiritual traditions and frameworks. It's kind of like very healthy to think of them as like prompts for the mind. I mean, essentially they're like recipes for achieving transformations of consciousness, which they reflect or they inform you about the nature of reality and the nature of consciousness. But the things that you say are true while you're meditating, or the things that you ponder, is this true or not, are kind of like orthogonal to truth. I mean, like they're like kind of like instructions that causes interesting effects. And the Buddha was like
Pragmatist.
really radically pragmatist. He's like, hey, like do these techniques and you will have like really huge like a liberatory factor on your suffering. And he might even say like, well, don't worry about like what it's actually true, right? Like in the moment, actually just engage with it as a meditation prompt.
He famously refused to answer many metaphysical and cosmological questions which were popular at the time and that other spiritual teachers did. Is the cosmos finite or infinite? It's not relevant to the ending of suffering. No. It does not apply. I'm not answering the question. Does a liberated person exist or not exist after death? I'm not answering the question. It's irrelevant. And likewise, anything he considered irrelevant to the project of successful prompts for coming to the end of suffering. Denied. Not engaging. Radically pragmatist.
Okay. Just like my computer might run out of fuel in like 12 minutes or something like that if I don't connect it. But I'll get to it in a moment. Or yeah, I guess if Richard, you could figure out like why this is not actually should be on, right? But I'm not sure. I'm not getting juice. But okay, yeah. In the interest of time, yeah. Like well, maybe you. Okay, wait. Actually, yeah, that sounded. It got turned on briefly, and like now it's.
Switch things, bro. I wonder if this could reach directly there.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know if you can try. It's a bit of a constraint satisfaction problem. Okay, so I mentioned like the 6 Buddhist realms. I think like one way of like thinking of them is as like attractors of the sort of thing that consciousness is. And again, like consciousness is like this thing that has this property of being like many things and one at the same time. Now, like the true ontology here is actually going to be like way more, intricate and sophisticated and surprising than what I'm about to show you. But there are like some systems that have kind of like interesting behaviors that I find like somewhat evocative for like the type of things that the Buddhist realms may be. Are you guys familiar with the 6 Buddhist realms, or like I guess like raise your hand if you haven't heard of them? Okay, so like I'll just like very briefly introduce it. Like it's when Buddha says like the freedom from death, sickness, and rebirth. It's talking about like the wheel of samsara, where there's like various like kinds of realms you may be born in and grow and die. Traditionally, they talk about like I think that did it. Yeah, that did it. Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, the heavenly realms, which is like the state of consciousness, where like you're actually like very integrated, it's very harmonious, very consonant. And the main thing that you're like focusing on is like well-being and pleasure and love and all the positive facets of consciousness. One of the main side effects, though, of like inhabiting the heavenly realms is that you're not cognizant of the reality of suffering. And it's like there's a lot of like these kind of like spiritual tropes or like stories in Buddhism about how people get confused in those realms and they believe that they are permanent. It's kind of like if you were born in a Christian context, you say like, okay, I prayed to Jesus, I went to heaven, and now I'm like liberated forever. Like I'm done, right? Like I'm close to God, like this is paradise, like I made it, right? But the Buddhists will say like, no, that's actually a delusion. You're still in samsara. Like you're just in a very pleasantly lit, corner of samsara, where the conditions are just like very pleasant. And don't get me wrong, it's actually legitimately good. The problem is that it's kind of like deceptive, right? And it doesn't ever last as long as you want, unfortunately. A second one is like the human realm. Roughly speaking, I guess like we are officially in the human realm. The characteristics of it involve that like, the thing you're trying to do is understand, propose frameworks, trying to predict the world, trying to understand like who you are, making sense of things. Very intellectually driven, and not necessarily kind of like, pleasure forward or trying to avoid suffering. Is kind of like the main disquieting thing you're trying to address is, the sense of curiosity and wonder and kind of like the life of the mind. The Asura realms, also called the Titan realms, is kind of like a realm of consciousness where the main point is kind of like to win and be the best and try to like beat everybody else. And they're always fighting, and it's actually considered kind of like a mixed realm in that like it actually has like a lot of like really awesome kind of like characteristics, like ambition and achievement and like
Power!
Yes. A lot of the a tamed version or kind of like de-diluted version of the Titan realm can actually be very beneficial, and at times like adding a little bit of Titan energies can like really help kind of like be motivated to accomplish things. The problem though is like it's very easy for you to get out of control, right? Like because you get irritated if you're like you got like second place and you're like like, oh, I hate the guy who got the gold, right? Like they're fighting all the time, and so like they're actually very likely to then like cause a lot of like negative karma along the way, and be reborn in like a bad realm. Then you have like the animal realm, which is characterized by really kind of like caring about like subtle pleasures and like simple attachments. It's kind of like, oh, I love waking up and like having a cup of tea and like a croissant, and like don't mess with that, right? Like don't distract me. Like that's like my pleasure, like my small pleasure. And routine, and kind of like just tagging along and just like not wondering deeply about the nature of reality, but also like you're kind of like shielded from like intense pleasure and pain, and it's kind of like a comfortable space, but it's kind of like dull, right? I guess like that would be a key
Yeah, the problem with it is ignorance.
Ignorance.
Yeah.
Hungry Ghost, that is kind of like the state of consciousness where like you always want like 50% more than what you got. It's like, oh, I wish the cake was a little bit larger, right? Like, or like my vacation was a little bit longer. Kind of like intense craving that you're not like really able to relieve. And then finally Hell Realm, which is kind of these all of these configurations of self-hatred and self-blame and intense pain, intense discomfort, intense anxiety and so on. Okay, so like one hypothesis is that, well, these are attractors, but not of the type of system that I guess like most people are familiar with. Not these are not attractors of, let's say, something like just the Conway's game of life. I'm going to hypothesize these are attractors of systems that are like highly integrated, that have that kind of this characteristic of having many facets and also being one thing at the same time. And again, this is not the complete picture, but it will give you a little bit of an intuition. As I mentioned, there is the distinction between recipe and review. I think like actually one of the key ways in which we ought to kind of like be able to review our state of consciousness is in terms of like really precise, actual like technical signal processing characteristics of our consciousness, right? Like, I'll give you a very simple example, right? Like if they say, hey, like meditate on a ball of light, and think of it that it's an angel or something like that. For most people, if they start to have kind of like an interesting experience where the ball of light like starts to grow and pulse, and they ask like, okay, like what was the result of that meditation? If they don't have like, that much of a technical mind, or they're not prompted to give a technical response, they will provide like very semantically loaded kind of descriptions, things such as like, well, it had like wings and it was trying to say that it, he loves me and something like that. Whereas, if I kind of like take seriously the idea like, well, but hey, you're actually kind of like this crazy, electromagnetic neural network, like what is the actual result of this meditation? You could describe it in like very technical terms, in terms of like, well, the angel was actually kind of like flickering, and it was flickering at 15 hertz. Like it's a very specific vibration, and if you've trained yourself to be able to like notice and name the frequencies of flickering lights, you're providing like some quantitative, rigorous information that like just a semantic, the semantic descriptions just don't provide, right? And a lot of the aesthetic of at least like our research institute is to kind of cleanly separate these and really kind of like put a lot of value and emphasis on like, hey, actually describing the results of your experience in these like very technical and precise terms, drawing concepts from like signal processing, even like statistics, machine learning, like it's actually like very helpful because it's like the kind of knowledge that we can actually build on top of. So what I'm showing you right now, it's actually one of the conceptual frameworks that we use to describe experiences and meditations and the results, and also states of mind in general, which is systems of coupled oscillators. If I say, systems of coupled oscillators, does this ring a bell with people? Or no? Okay, so the very simple example is like when you have a bunch of metronomes, like pacemakers, or like in music, or like you have like this, there's a term in English, I forget, but like it gives you the sense of like the pace at which you should be playing the music. If you put them on a table that has a little bit of a wiggle, and you just let them be, eventually they actually all kind of like synchronize, right? Like they, in these terms, they phase lock, or they align in phase, and they synchronize. So this is kind of like one very simple example of a system of coupled oscillators. Now here's the thing. If you have like a very, very long row of these oscillators, they actually will not synchronize. Like, they only synchronize if you have a certain number of them. But if you actually make the system very, very large, at some point, what you really have will have kind of these like patches of synchronies, or maybe even kind of like traveling waves of like synchronization. And it is this sort of like vocabulary that I think like actually like is very generative to like, precisely describe some aspects of experience. What I'm showing you here is sort of similar. Like each of these squares, you can think of it as a clock. And the color that you see has to do with like the angle at which the clock is oriented, like the phase, as it would be called. So like each hour of the day has a different color. And what's happening here is that each square is trying to get closer to the phase or the angle or the hour of its neighbors, and kind of like the region that is like close to them. And as I was mentioning, right, like because like it's a sufficiently large grid, it is the case that they actually just don't all synchronize, or like you end up having kind of these like traveling waves of synchrony, and it's interesting in that way. But here's the twist. This has a little bit of a richer structure, which is that you have like two plates of oscillators, but they're actually like on top of each other. I mean, I'm actually just kind of like visualizing it this way, but like in reality, you should think of it as like, well, every square has a corresponding square on the other side. I mean, these are like two screens, such that it also wants to couple with it and kind of like mirror it, or like be in the same phase. And the way we start in this simulation, it loops around, but you'll see in a second, is like where the left side of the screen is trying to synchronize with the right side of the screen, and the right side of the screen is trying to synchronize with the left. So this is kind of when you're like talking to a friend, and you tell your friend like, hey, mirror me, right? And you also mirror that other person. You also mirror your friend, right? Like, so, okay, like naturally you will both kind of like interlock into doing the same movements, right? Now here's where it gets interesting. As the simulation evolves, you see like I modify one of the levers there. Okay, so like here's where they're both trying to imitate each other. And then I put the second, the bottom lever, I turn it all the way negative. And what that does is that it makes it asymmetrical. What do I mean by this? Which is that the left side of the screen is trying to imitate the right side, but when I make it negative, make that parameter negative, then the right side is going to try to do something different than the left side. And what this generates is chaos and complexity, and it destabilizes the attractor. I mean, one kind of like simple metaphor for where this shows up in practice is, for example, in fashion, where like that you might have kind of the cool kids who are like always, imitating each other, perhaps like, okay, within their cluster trying to kind of like have like interesting fashion that they're imitating each other. And then maybe like the people who kind of like late to fashion, use them as a reference for like, okay, like that's fashionable, and okay, I'm gonna put on that type of clothes. But here's the kicker, right? Like the cool kids, they want to differentiate themselves from the unwashed masses, right? So it's like they will constantly be trying to like, okay, like this is already too passé, right? Like people are already imitating this, let's move on to the next thing. So when you have kind of these like asymmetrical relationships where like A is trying to be like B, but B is trying to be different, that's a mechanism by which you get kind of like an endless generation of information and chaos and complexity. You know, I'm gonna suggest, you know, that this is actually one of kind of the characteristic, you know, algorithmic qualities of, let's say, some of these, like, let's say, a little bit more unpleasant states of consciousness. Like, in some sense, to be kind of like being the Titan realm, trying to be the best, is kind of like internally a little bit kind of like embody this asymmetric dynamic, right? It's like you're trying to be the best and you're trying the other person to not be the best. Whereas, you know, something kind of like the heavenly realms, the God realms, as they're also called, it is a state of consciousness where you're actually totally comfortable with like everybody imitating each other and actually, you know, enter into synchronization and harmony and more pleasant configurations. And so once you start to kind of like maybe think of the mind, you know, in this kind of like, okay, like systemic structural way, you can develop vocabulary to actually kind of like start to review what happens in meditation with more like kind of like technical precision in a way that, you know, hopefully will actually allow us to make more scientific progress. Now, of course, you know, the brain and, and the mind and the vascular system and everything that compose us is way more complex than, you know, just two screens. These would be kind of like one level higher up in kind of the complexity ladder, which is like, it's also hierarchical, right? Like, so as it turns out, you know, your visual cortex has like a bunch of layers. And as you climb up the layers, you know, neurons kind of like are tuned to like broader and bigger features. And, you know, this is kind of schematical. It's schematic, although, you know, I'm actually like the simulation is accurate, it's like mathematically accurate. To kind of like give you an idea, it's like one way of thinking about this is like, well, let's say this is the left side of your left hemisphere in your visual cortex. This is like the right side. And there's kind of this hierarchical organization. I mean, like really these are pyramids, by which I mean that if you look at this square, it is not only connected to like its neighbors within its own kind of like plate, it's also connected to, you know, the left one corresponding to the other plate, but then it's also connected to the plates below and above. And the way that connection happens is that for each square on a given layer, it is connected to 4 squares on the grid that is kind of like higher resolution, right? So you get kind of this like pyramidal structure that has kind of like a left and a right component. Now, here's the thing, exactly that relationship that I was describing of, you know, you have like symmetrical relationships or symmetrical coupling or asymmetrical coupling. Here you can do, but across the board. You know, you can say like, okay, I want these to be asymmetrically coupled to these, but these two to be symmetrically coupled, right? So you end up kind of like having this like much more complex kind of like ecosystem of relationships that favor different types of patterns and, you know, harmonies and consonances. And I'm going to claim actually that, you know, to a large extent, you know, our capacity to generate novelty and complexity and, you know, a sense of self has to do with kind of the ways in which the parts of us actually are kind of refusing to become one or harmonize or cohere. And it is, you know, something like through the practice of jhana meditation that you kind of like learn to favor and tune into and foster more these kind of like other dynamics of symmetrical coupling. You're not trying to kind of like fight yourself. You're not trying to compete against yourself or try to be the best or something like that. It's like, no, you can actually just like sit down and relax and become one with yourself. With, of course, at the limit, might actually feel like becoming one with everything. Now, I know, yeah, in the interest of time, I'm gonna, yeah, very briefly like go through a couple more slides and then open up for questions. I think like, you know, what I was describing is like, okay, like it's very beneficial to think of this like separation between like like the recipe, the review, the prompts, and let's say like the, you know, statistical, structural, algorithmic effects that they have. But if we kind of like double click on prompts, you know, like can we use the concept of kind of like prompt engineering or like how a prompt might work in a machine learning system to analyze like what makes for a good meditation practice, or like why some meditation practices are like more effective than others, or like in what way you can kind of like boost, you know, the power of a prompt. It occurs to me that there's like, you know, 5 like really powerful principles, which I'm like listing here. One is like expectation maximization, by which I mean, your mind and body and brain is constantly trying to predict what's going to happen next. That we are, in some sense, next token predictors. At the very least, like some aspects of us are kind of next token predictors. This comes from predictive processing frameworks, free energy principle frameworks, and that's like really important because, I mean, if you think about it, like one of the ways you can access the first jhana, the very concentrated pleasant state in the body of kind of like body pleasure and rapture, is essentially like you sit down and you kind of like tell your system, your whole organism, you say, hey, I'm experiencing pleasant body vibrations, even if it's not true, right? Like even it's just like you're just kind of like describing and you're like invoking them. You're saying like, yes, I am like made of bliss. I am made of like waves of love and pleasure. And at first, okay, like what you're claiming is the case will not match with what you're actually experiencing. But, that causes kind of like a sense of inner tension or dissonance. And at some point, your body and your mind figures out how to kind of like satisfy your predictions. In some senses, it's easier for your mind in that case to actually figure out how to generate those vibrations and those pleasant waves inside you than to kind of like try to stop you from like making those invocations. In other words, if you treat something as true, at least insofar as the bounds of your own mind is concerned, eventually it actually may become true, especially if it is possible. If your body can figure out a way how to satisfy your prediction, right? And this is very very related also to how if you treat your body as a particular system, you imagine it as a system, or you add like some inputs that make it be like that's such a system, eventually it figures out how to like predict and how to generate those sensations again. I mean, like one of the early kind of like experiments that I did when I was exploring, like using like body vibration as a way of enhancing meditation, which I did a bunch of research on that in 2020, 2021. You can actually find our video where we explain all of our findings of that research. It's called Exploratory Haptic Research at QRI on YouTube. So one of the exercises that I did was putting on myself this like device that vibrates at, actually any frequency that you want, but I was using 40 hertz because in the literature, people have been like, writing a lot of papers about like how 40 hertz can actually like delay Alzheimer's, or it has all sorts of like interesting like, sometimes like positive biological effects. For the most part, like with audio and with like stroboscopic stimulation, like for example, with like some like rodents that are bred to develop Alzheimer's or a model of Alzheimer's, if you flash them with like 40 hertz stimulation, some of them actually like stay kind of like cognitively younger for much longer. So, I thought like, well, maybe there is something to these like 40 hertz. Maybe there's like something special about it, and I decided to kind of like go very deep into that. So every day for 3 weeks, I was putting in my body like a 40 hertz body vibration for 20 minutes while meditating and listening to music. And it's like, okay, like I'm just gonna see like what kind of effect this has on me, and and then I'll report. We will find out. Well, it turns out after like 3 weeks of doing this consistently, I actually started to have sleep paralysis, where like you wake up and you can't move and you're kind of like trapped in a nightmare world. But where I was like trapped in a world or universe that was like just vibrating at 40 hertz. And it's like, oh my gosh, it's like, and actually very unpleasant, like very high amplitude vibrations, like the sort of thing that like it almost feels like you're gonna tear yourself apart. And it's like really spooky and scary, and like that happened for several nights. And like it's like, okay, like I probably shouldn't put like any more 40 hertz in my body because my body is like kind of like learning to expect it, right? And when it's not getting that vibration, it starts to actually hallucinate it and generating it for me. Now, this is kind of like a bad application of this principle, but you can think of it as a more general thing. It's like, hey, if you train yourself to either like believe you're experiencing something, or you actually make yourself experience it at a certain level of amplitude, especially if it's something that has kind of this quality of kind of a field-like behavior, which I'll explain in a second what I mean by that. Eventually your body learns to kind of like generate those sensations on its own, to kind of like internally satisfy those predictions. Now, what I mean by field, there's like, of course, like a lot of different ways of defining a field and field in physics. Really, I'm really kind of like pointing at some of the really core characteristics here, which is that this idea that there is a set of kind of which we might describe as a wave equation and a surface to which it applies, right? Like if you have like a bucket of water, the waves of water have like certain characteristic. Waves in water look different than like waves in like mercury or like waves in honey. The actual material determines what type of waves you may have. And because it's like the same material throughout like the entire bucket, the waves behave the same, right? So, this connects to something like this. Like if you think of your body as a certain type of field, this by the way is like a piece of software that we're developing at QRI to like visualize tactile sensations and meditation states. What I'm actually visualizing here is the transition from like a very pleasant meditative state to DMT type of configuration. But like the patterning, like the types of waves that you may feel in your body, like reflect the state of consciousness that you're in. And there's a sense in which they're kind of like two sides of the same coin. So when I say if you treat your body as a field, it will eventually learn to behave like a field, I mean that, well, you imagine that your whole body and your whole mind is all kind of homogeneously made of the same material. And then you try to kind of like hone in on, okay, like what type of material and what kind of waves does that material make? Because you can actually kind of like homogenize that feeling, then the waves will travel quite effectively and without resistance. In a more normal state of consciousness, I would say, the types of kind of like the field behaviors or the textures will be like more like diverse and more intricate. In a normal state of consciousness, actually, you might have a kind of like a patchwork of these kind of like different textures. There's like an aspect of you that maybe feels anxiety and is kind of like feels corrugated, and a part of you feels kind of like in a more pleasant, peaceful state, and is like more, let's say, kind of like a silk or a very very soft fabric. But the main takeaway of this part is to say that when you expect your body to feel a pleasant vibration, it will eventually figure out how to satisfy that expectation. And a lot of meditation can be understood this way, right? Like think of like elemental meditation. Like back in the day, 10 years ago, when people said like, hey, you can become fire meditating. It's like I thought like, oh, this is such like crackpot. Right? It's like, what do you mean you can become fire? I thought like, well, and on top of that, usually with this type of meditations, people might say like, well, there's actually just like 4 elements, right? Like fire, earth, air, water, and even some people might claim like, no, that's actually the truth, and like whatever science says about like the elements of the periodic table, like that's like made up, that's a dream. How do they know that? Because they can tune into the element of fire and feel it in their body, become fire or become water. Well, having like thought a lot about it and actually, kind of experimented with these techniques, I would actually kind of like reinterpret this as actually when you're imagining that you're fire, you're actually kind of instantiating this field behavior, right? Like you're almost kind of like trying to tune into a type of cellular automata that has a certain type of rules such that the waves that arise are fire-like. I don't think you're literally becoming fire or like tuning into the spirit of fire, but you're tuning into kind of the self-organizing principles that usually give rise to fire-like behavior. And that's actually extremely powerful, right? Because if you can actually homogenize your field of experience into something that is fire-like, it can undo a lot of internal, tension points. It can like undo knots. It can be like a really powerful, psychotechnology. And I'll just, conclude with a couple final slides and then open up for questions and chit-chat. I'm a very, very big fan of Robert Bia. Who here knows Robert Bia? Okay, maybe half of the people. I would actually think of him as a master prompter. Like a lot of the things that he does and the way he explains how to approach meditation, seeing them through the lens of, hey, prompting mechanisms, I think is like really insightful and generative. And he identifies kind of like the conditions on which, let's say, like very subtle prompts actually are really powerful. Like one of the things he mentions is that when you're like really concentrated, like already have achieved a certain level of samadhi, a certain level of unification, and kind of like the mind becomes just like one thing, or like the center of your attention is just like one big bucket. Very subtle suggestions can have like really powerful effects. Right, like maybe when you're kind of like really distracted or like you were feeling anxious in a normal state of consciousness, you may need like something really loud to kind of like draw your attention, to say something like, oh, you are God, or like you are made of love, or something like that. If you're like really concentrated already in a kind of like the depth of a meditation state, you can just say something kind of like, oh, love, right? Like just a very subtle whisper, and it's kind of like a seed in the mind that actually the conditions are ripe, such that you just need one seed to create this like huge tree. Whereas like maybe usually it's like very dry. You need like hundreds and hundreds of seeds, and maybe none of them will sprout. But interestingly, as well, like I would say that bliss, like the sense of rapture is another one of these things that like really amplifies and intensifies the power of a particular prompt. And there's probably like a very solid structural reason why, which is that, well, if we are right at QRI that, the structure of your experience and these waves, are the determinant factor for like how good or bad you feel, in our model, very pleasant configurations tend to be like very harmonious and coherent. There's almost kind of just like one big wave in your body, that is coherent, part of the same system, versus, let's say, like in a very irritated, chaotic, unpleasant state of consciousness where you feel kind of like fragmented. Again, like you're maybe like a patchwork of like different, types of materials. And so like the waves, like they don't travel very well, because it's like, well, here are like water waves and here are like fire waves, and they look different. They don't talk to each other very well. Well, if you're like in this like very rapturous, blissful state, it's sort of like you're all just one field already, right? So like whatever prompt you add to the system, that information can propagate, very easily, without losing a lot of energy. It's a very efficient way of kind of like spreading that information around. And then, yeah, like another thing that I think is really important, especially to kind of like make sense of how different spiritual traditions actually achieve what they do, is the power of metaphor, right? Like, because, not all parts of us have kind of like access to kind of like technical understanding of reality, or even all that philosophical. There's a lot of parts of us you can really describe as like, well, a 4-year-old that is like still kind of like being protected by all of the rest of the sub-agents. You have to like figure out how to talk to those parts as well. Like not only kind of like, okay, the smart part of you, but yeah, the full you, like all of your parts. And a lot of your parts like really only talk in terms of like metaphors. And what metaphors, is not just identifying, well, an isomorphism, or identifying like a shared structure into realms, because metaphors also come with imports. Like how you choose to metaphorize something gives you access to an action space that is like unique to that metaphor. Well, like this is a table from Metaphors We Live by Lakoff, a very interesting research. If you think of the mind as a machine, if you think like, oh, the mind is a machine, then the idea that you can break down makes sense, right? Like if, you think of consciousness as light, then the idea that awareness can be brilliant makes sense, right? Like any metaphor that you use comes with a lot of imports that are not just like the core metaphor, but it's like all of these like peripheral kind of like supporting structure. And so, this is both an opportunity, but also something you have to be careful with, right? Like that you have to kind of distinguish that, well, if you're using this as a prompt to enact a particular state of consciousness, realize that subconsciously you're going to bring all of the imports of the metaphors that you're going to be using, right? So, and to some extent, like you may be somewhat constrained in like what may unfold, partly by the way in which your metaphors might be like just too restricted, or you may be drawing from like a very mundane world where actually you should be drawing for something much larger. And I think like this is circling back to kind of like conclude the slides. I think like this allows us to make sense of a lot of kind of like the imagery and the implicit metaphors that exist in spirituality. I mean, like if you say, hey, the universe is one big vibration, right? Like that comes with a huge number of imports. I mean, things such as, well, the universe is like an orchestra, and like we're making a melody, right? Like and we can harmonize with each other, we can synchronize with each other. All of those are like imports that come from the metaphor. If you say, like everything is ultimately just pure space, well, that also carries a lot of imports having to do with like distances and metrics and curvature. And one of the things that Robert Bea will emphasize is that, well, even if you kind of like in the moment in a let's say like intense sixth jhana experience, you may feel like, oh, the body is like electric and made of electricity, and I think of myself as a capacitor, and like all these like electrical engineering metaphors. He might say like, yes, that's actually like really helpful and can be really powerful, but you also have to be mindful that even that is like mind-made. Or like even that you're actually like maybe less finding out the true nature of consciousness and more like you're attaining what he might describe as a meditation or as a attainment in your views, like how you can actually sorry, he described them as perception attainments is a term that he used, right? Like if you can actually experience yourself as a ball of electricity, it's not necessarily that you have like realized, oh my gosh, I am actually made of electricity. It's more like you have tuned into a state of consciousness where the view about reality, where you see things as electricity, has become unlocked, right? And if you're stuck in this idea that like, well, actually, yes, I discovered that I'm made of electricity, you're constraining again, like what kind of thing you may be. And it may be the case that at the fundamental nature of our minds, maybe we are actually made of electrons, and like electric potential actually matters. But that is very different than kind of like what experiences unfold when you see yourself, as made of electricity. And it's important to not confuse the two, because one will constrain, what may actually arise in consciousness, whereas the other is more kind of just an empirical matter. And I think I will leave it right there for the slides, and very happy to answer questions and audience participation. Thank you, everybody. Yeah.
So for Wystan, before the Buddha had his full awakening, there were plenty of meditation masters getting to the jhanas. Why couldn't they see Tana?
Well, I mean, it's unclear, and we'll never know how much of the Buddha's, in the records, he claims a kind of exclusive realization that I alone among the whole world have attained to this unexcelled right self-awakening. There's no one else before me. Well, actually, he says that there were previous Buddhas in past aeons, but he rediscovered the path, and no one else. How much of that is marketing? I don't know. But in what records we have the Buddha studied with Alara Kalama and Udaka Ramaputta. Those are the two teachers that he studied with and mastered the states that they taught, which were the realm of nothingness and the realm of neither perception nor non-perception, which are, if you have the sequence of 8 jhanas, these progressively refined series of absorptions, they're formless, the body is gone. They're very kind of exalted, refined, temporary states of perception. You don't see other teachers talking about the first 4 jhanas or boundless space or boundless consciousness in the texts that we have anyway. I imagine that plenty of other meditators and plenty of other human nervous systems hit upon these attractor states. The way that the Buddha harnessed them to then use that calm, collected, concentrated mind, not just to marinate and saturate and steep and enjoy that for its own sake, which is great, but taking that calm, clear, collected mind and then turning it in on itself and penetrating to the depth and the thoroughness that he did, the conditional nature of how his senses came together and the confusion of identity that causes that craving and clinging cyclically. No one else, at least that we have record of, did it as well as he did. Anyway. Yeah.
I was wondering if you have any takes on the differences between the Sutrayana perspective of awakening and the Tantrayana perspective of awakening.
Yeah, that's a pretty broad question.
So I guess, I don't know if you've ever read any of David Chapman's stuff.
Yeah, sure.
So like the idea of like Sutrayana being kind of anti-life or anti-existence and trying to like null oneself out of that versus the Tantrayana perspective of like trying to, I don't know exactly what they're trying to do. It seems pretty unclear. I would love to learn more, but.
Yeah, so relating to what I was talking about earlier, the early Buddhist texts, kind of the foundation of the tradition, it's really looking at the whole path and practice from the perspective of the problem. Here we are, embodied beings. We're going to get sick. We're going to get old. We're going to die. And before that, we crave and cling and create an awful lot of suffering for ourselves. And unfortunately, that leaks out and affects other people too. Shit, what do we do? What distinguishes like Vajrayana, Tantrayana, yana means vehicle. is the distinctiveness of the methods that they use, and the kind of revaluation of the senses. So in early Buddhism, all of the senses are impermanent. They're constantly changing. You can't even grasp them for a moment. Let go. They're dukkha. They're unsatisfactory. Let go. They're not you. They're not yours. Let go. So all of these lenses are kind of getting you to let go and to realize the end of suffering that way. In Tantra, in Vajrayana, in Tantric Buddhism, the senses are metaphorically reevaluated as the aggregates that I was talking about. Those are conceived of classically as 5 Buddhas, 5 kind of cosmic Buddhas that are like the manifestations of the aggregates are Buddhas. They're already awakened. The 5 elements, fire, earth, water, air, and space, are the consorts of those 5 Buddhas, and the aggregates and the elements are joined in sexual union. So like the aggregates and the elements of experience are kind of a blissful, already awakened arising. So this is all metaphor and symbol. It's working like Andrés was telling. These potent metaphors and symbols can act and prompt our consciousness to realize the nature of the aggregates, to realize the nature of the elements, to realize the nature of the senses, not as gross, icky things that we want to grasp or let go, push away. It achieves the same result of the release of craving and clinging, but through a kind of transformation of perception and a revaluation, putting a different lens on it. But the result of the release of craving and clinging and awakening to the nature of mind is the same.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, sure.
Do you think that has impacts on the like there's the idea of the path of the arhat and the path of the bodhisattva?
Mhm.
One of those maybe more quietist or more like just like kind of go off in a cave and be blissful, and the other one is more like maybe try to achieve nobility or something like that for the sake of all beings. Do you think the methods have like pretty strong impact on which outcome you end up as?
Yeah, I think there's probably a mix of both, and you can see in the development of the traditions historically, and in what now in the spiritual smorgasbord, like what path of practice that someone is drawn to, partly is a function of their character, right? What they find appealing, what mix of afflictions and desires they've got. If someone who really wants sensuality and pleasure, probably going to be drawn more to Tantra. Someone who's like, I hate this shit, I just want out, please, probably going to be more attracted to more renunciate paths, right? So the perspective from within the tradition is actually that all of these paths, all of these methods, all of these views have only been concocted, constructed, and offered on the basis of individuals' predilections. That all of these are skillful means, they're conditional, they're not ultimate, much like Rob Rebay is pointing to. I mean, that's the traditions that he's drawing on, is that all of these lenses are ways fit to individuals' capacities and predilections, so that they can employ them, use these methods, and realize the same end of suffering. And as for how the being, the person is affected, yeah, the methods definitely will have effects on someone's experience, how they present, how they manifest. So people, I don't know if you've hung around many hardcore Theravada monastics versus Vajrayana gurus, very different vibe. And yeah, that probably is both a function of which path they were attracted to, and also the conditioning that those different practices have had on them. So they may have realized the same kind of freedom of mind and non-grasping, but on a more relative level, how they show up is going to be different for sure.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I have a question about, I think you claim that you don't see the world as a game of Conway, but
Yeah.
then I didn't quite follow what was the evidence that it's not. Because it seemed like the 3-dimensional pyramid was like a 3-dimensional version of Conway's game.
Yeah. No, I mean, I did mention that the systems of coupled oscillators are not like the actual kind of mathematical object that may correspond to something like a moment of experience is not just a system of coupled oscillators. You require something else that actually will provide kind of the glue to actually make it a unified thing. you can definitely emulate something like like the pyramidal structure with Conway's Game of Life, and in that sense, like it doesn't belong to a completely different category. But at least like functionally, something like the pyramid that I was describing or that I was showing does have kind of like this very high level of interconnectivity and integration, or like all of the different parts are like interacting with each other. But yeah, it's not like breaking the ontology, and it's definitely still within like the cellular automaton class. Yeah, it's more kind of like evocative of it.
I guess where I'm going with it is have you found any evidence? Because I think what you said is like something we're very confident in is that it's not like the game of Conway.
Yeah.
What is the evidence that we really are just this mechanical Billard ball system game of Conway?
You're asking like what is the evidence that we are?
That we're not.
Oh, that we're not.
I thought you said
Yeah.
we're not. Like you're like, we're
Yeah.
confident we're not just Conway.
Yes.
Because there's like these, I guess, actions at a distance or something going on, or.
I mean, yeah, no, this is an excellent question. If you want like the full download, I would recommend reading the Substack post. Fixed buckets can't phenomenally bind. Like that is like the article title. I mean, I guess like there's like two key reasons. I mean, like one is like from physics, we have like very strong reasons to believe like the physical world is not Conway's like Game of Life like system. What I call like a tier 1 system. Actually, let me just like bring up the different tiers. Yeah, it's like just way towards the beginning. Yeah. So here's kind of like 3 tiers. The first one is what I call tier 1 type of system, which has like a universal time and a universal space. It's like like there's this universal kind of like plane of simultaneity, like all the squares like have like inhabit the same time. That already makes it like just non-physical, right? Like because depending on how fast you're moving and where you're traveling to and like how close you are to black hole, like that determines like the rate of the passage of time, like meaning that like you're not gonna get that out of something like simple Conway's Game of Life. A tier 2 type of system is something that in the literature you will find described as like process physics, which is like people who are kind of like modifying cellular automatons to try to make them more like physics-like and try to reconstruct like relativity out of them. And this is like the sort of system where there's no universal clock and there's no universal time. Rather, there's just a collection of like nodes and their local connections. But who are you connected to is variable. So like depending on like the local configuration, and a node. And each node also has its own clock. So it's kind of like each node has its own clock, and whenever the clock ticks, as it were, it updates like who is connected to, based on like a set of rules having to do with it.
Basically, like a relative game of Conway.
Yeah, this would be kind of like you could think of like a relativistic game of Conway, where when you have like a very dense region of the network, there's kind of like more time passing. There's like more interactions. But the problem there is that you still have kind of this limiting factor, which is like at no point you have anything that is like many and one at the same time, or that where the behavior of it you cannot predict just in terms of its various parts.
Why not? That's not followed.
Yeah, I mean it's because the rules are completely local still, and you don't have a mechanism that kind of like looks at.
That's what I'm saying. It is still completely local.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
So I guess like
the third one is not local.
The third one is it's not only just not local. It's something I would describe as like holistic in nature. So this is like the simplest toy model that I've been able to come up with that kind of like crosses into the type of system that I think like might explain at least consciousness, if not physics. So essentially, a tier 3 type of system has like 3 steps. So it has like a fully local update rule, which is like very much like a system 2 type tier. But then it also has like a boundary drawing mechanism. There's like something that allows the system to figure out, okay, like all of these nodes belong to the same object. And like that object, I'm gonna treat it as just like one being. Now, one being of precisely the sort of thing that we are, which is like, well, we are like one experience, but we have like a lot of different pixels of sensation at the same time. Or like we're one and many at the same time. It's like, how can we construct something that is like one and many at the same time in the relevant way? Well, you draw a boundary, and in this particular toy example, the way you draw the boundary is by computing the strongly connected components, which is like, okay, like when you have like a node, 2 nodes, sets of nodes is such that like any 2 pairs of nodes within that set can like reach each other by traveling. along the connections. And then it behaves as a unit. This is the technical term here is like non-factorizability, meaning that you cannot individually kind of like predict, utilize the various components and predict what's going to happen next in each of the components, and then aggregate, get that information to get the next step. You actually need to see the entire system as a whole to know what's going to happen in the next step. And at least in the toy model, the way you accomplish this is like everything that is within the strongly connected component, you apply what's called like the PageRank algorithm, which is like, like what is the probability that you will find yourself in what node if you do an infinite path in it. But the key thing is that the update rule is like all at once. Like it's not like you're going to iterate the nodes one at a time. It's like, no, you see the entire component and then you find the weights in just one step.
But the
Yes.
key piece, if I'm understanding correctly, is
Yes.
that tier 3, you have to know the whole system to predict any one piece.
Yes.
Where again in Conway you could predict it just from. Okay.
Exactly. Precisely in a tier 3 system, you completely break this notion that a system's behavior is exactly just the sum of its parts.
And is part of the reason you have evidence this because in physics, electrical spins can communicate from afar, and because of gravity, is that part
Yeah,
of
I mean, in physics, the most straightforward example is just like quantum coherence, where like you need to take into account essentially like all of the electrons that are in a state of coherence and their relative positions to know like what's going to happen next.
Okay.
And like the electrons
That
kind of
is
like,
a piece of that that is informing this point of view.
yeah.
Okay.
And then the other one is just like the unity of our experience. Because if it wasn't the case that our experience had this kind of like holistic behavior, there would be no evolutionary selection pressures to select the type of experiences that we have, where like they have precisely this characteristic of like many pieces of information at
You're
once.
saying it would have not been survival of the fittest for us to have these unity experiences.
Correct. Like
What is a unity experience? You mean you kind of
or
feel
ju-
like you see God?
No, just like a moment of experience. Again, like even just right now, your visual field has like a lot of different textures. They're like happening like to the same subject or to the same experiencer. It's kind of like,
oh, because I remember I saw that tree.
or even just without memory, just like the present moment. Like you open your eyes and like, you see a couch and a person and some colors. And like all of that has kind of like, they contextualize each other and they kind of like reflect each other, and the experience is the way in which they're reflecting each other. That like if there wasn't any kind of holistic behavior or like any benefit to kind of presenting all the information at once, if it wasn't a difference that was produced by having this unity, then evolution wouldn't care about it. Like clearly evolution has like really spent a lot of time trying to make these like very beautifully crafted experiences that are like unified in the moment to generate behavior. Yeah.
Does anything that lives not have this unification, are you saying? Like does an
We
animal?
we don't know. I mean, like I would argue that like very, very likely all animals have like moments of experience, or like even insects. I suspect they have like a tiny mini world simulation inside them that does have kind of this characteristic of like many pieces of information at once. But I'm not saying that your whole organism has that property. Right? Like I don't think your nail is like actually contributing to your moment of experience. Maybe the boundary of things that are contributing to a moment of experience may be more restricted to something like, well, the thalamocortical loop, or something kind of like, much more central to just the nervous system. But yeah, I mean, like, and I do think like, like a lot of like the very exotic, weird things that we experience on psychedelics and meditation precisely are kind of like playing with these like holistic behavior. These things that like, hey, like the whole thing just behaves as just one unit. And like, this is why like these things like do just like so non-physical in a sense, or like, yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was wondering, do you think sufficiently focused sobriety is like Turing complete over like all subjective experience?
Oh,
Or,
I see.
Or do you think that there are certain states that you would like, I guess like specifically humans would only be able to reach, like assisted by like DMT or something like that?
I mean, when you say like sufficiently focused sobriety, are you also taking into account like meditation?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well,
I would count that
yeah.
to be like the most focused, kind of like sober state. And I guess like it's kind of in
Yeah.
tension with one of the principles of Buddhism, which is kind of like to generally like not take substances. And
Yeah,
so I'm
yeah.
wondering, like the tension there.
Yeah, I doubt it. I mean, I would say that. I mean, I think like meditation can produce an extraordinarily large range of effects, including things such as like really high-end, like high-dose DMT-like type of effects, but with some caveats, which is that some of the preliminary research that we have conducted on kind of like classifying the different wave dynamics and patterns in the visual field on different states of consciousness, when we use those tools to kind of like try to replicate, for example, the effects of like fire casina, which is like the fire candle meditation, candle fire meditation, which is like very trippy, and like is really powerful. And I personally haven't done a fire casino retreat. I look forward to do one. But yeah, people say like, yeah, these were like profoundly psychedelic. But then if you look at actually like what kind of patterns they select for kind of replicating those, they don't really match any particular psychedelic. Like they are kind of like somewhere, it's something that shares properties with DMT and shares properties with 5-MeO-DMT, but is really neither of the two. And I would be surprised, if actually you could like precisely tune into the DMT frequencies, because that does seem to me like very kind of like hardware dependent and like really having to do with like the very fine level wiring. I don't know, and I doubt you can access it from the top down. And in addition to that, I think it might very well be the case that a whole class of substances, let's say like DMT, maybe even psychedelics in general, can be replicated with meditation. But I'm actually kind of skeptical you could do meditation that would kind of actually generate like the feeling of ketamine, because that to me like seems like it's really kind of like tapping into like some very kind of like biophysical changes in your body that like are very very close to the metal, as it were. Like ketamine, at least in our model at QRI, is very connected to slowing down waves in the body, and like the speed of wave propagation, kind of like it's almost like you're adding molasses to your system, and things are like slower. And the crazy effects that arise from ketamine at high doses is because all of these different systems have like slower waves, and now they can't like sync up to each other as they could normally. And I do think it is something like, well, you really are not going to be able to change the speed of a wave in water unless you add a bunch of sugar or like actually change the material. That said, does that like really matter or not for like liberation? Like, well, apparently not. Right? Like, it probably does matter for like foundational research, right? Like in being serious about figuring out the nature of reality, but otherwise probably not. Yeah. So yes.
Yeah, so this notion that all of us have probably only experienced like a narrow slice of what's possible to experience, and you can prompt yourself differently to get different outcomes. So like what are the good prompts and what are the bad prompts? Like to explore this, like any things to avoid and like
Yes.
any interesting things to try, kind of.
Yeah. Have you noticed the effect that when you hit your foot against the door, or you accidentally insult somebody, like the effect that it has to say like, oh, I'm such an idiot, right? Like that is like a prompt, right? It's actually like really powerful, and like we may not realize just like the power of kind of like how like self-deprecation or like insulting oneself actually has. Like that would be like maybe catalog in the space of like bad prompts. In general, prompts I would empirically kind of like make the case that point in the direction of the three characteristics. I mean, which is
Time tested.
yeah, they're time tested. I mean, like when you, the kind of thing that you're paying attention to is like the way in which experience is like fleeting, impermanent, like a dynamic system. It never settles into anything, or if it evokes the sense of like, well, there's no unified permanent self that is experiencing all of what I'm experiencing, or like kind of there's nothing that will permanently satisfy me. Those are actually like potentially like long-term, like quite healthy and grounded, because they seem to actually match kind of like the truth of experience. Whereas, alternatively, any kind of like meditation practice where the thing that you're emphasizing is, for example, like the permanency of things, or like how like things can be like permanently satisfying, or how they can actually, you have like an eternal self. In the long term, maybe in the moment may actually produce like very beautiful visualizations and hallucinations, but in the long term, you're reinforcing a view that like contradicts reality, and at some point, like that made up reality will actually like break and is going to be unpleasant. So, that's a very general heuristic. But I would say, yeah, like, I mean, looking at the whole panoply, the whole arsenal of like different meditation techniques in Buddhism and various like adjacent systems like Jainism and so on, there's a huge diversity of like really well time-tested prompts, essentially. And Wystan knows way many more than I do. So feel free to ask him about it. Yes. Yeah, anybody else? Yeah.
I don't know how to.
You choose.
Okay.
So I'm a bit new to quality's research, but
Yes.
I'm curious if you actually categorize different states of consciousness.
Yeah.
Because you mentioned 5-MeO
Yes.
or ketamine, but I'm also curious about different emotional states like grief as suffering versus grief as ecstasy. Are
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, it's yeah. I mean, like to give you like a little bit of a rundown, right? Like the yeah. What should I do best right now? Like yeah, like you see this yeah, this sort of like thing, like like we build dynamical systems where we like really know exactly like how the like mathematics are implementing it, and then we allow participants to you see all of these are kind of like dials by which you can kind of like change the parameters of the system, and it produces like different type of dynamic effects. Like the sort of recent research that we have conducted is like mapping what you see on the screen to different like emotional, meditation, and even like painful states of consciousness. And we have like quite a bit of data where we can like to some degree of confidence say, hey, like which patterns correspond to, for example, like DMT, and which patterns correspond to like LSD or like 2CB and ketamine, 5-MeO-DMT, or like fire casina or like jhana. We are currently actually developing the data set for doing this for like more like core emotions. I mean, like the main things that we're looking at is valence and arousal. So like, for example, like feeling like energetic but feeling good, or like feeling energetic and feeling bad. At some point this year, we intend to actually like dive much deeper into like kind of like emotions at a higher level of granularity. It hadn't occurred to me to, for example, like distinguish two types of grief, but I could definitely see like a way of like actually approaching that, and it would actually be along the lines of also like in terms of coupling dynamics, because you can think of like grief as, what was the term used, like grief as suffering versus grief as suffering contains like clinging, and it contains like attachment, and quite literally, at least in kind of these like mathematical models that we're developing, you can point to at least to like what this clinging thing refers to in terms of these like coupling dynamics, where, for example, here like I'm actually visualizing the vascular system, and also visualizing kind of like waves traveling in the surface of your skin. I would actually hypothesize that like grief as a suffering is actually biophysically implemented by, let's say, like some waves in your vascular system actually trying to couple together with waves in your skin, and like you're essentially experiencing some patterns and not trying to just hold on to them and not let them go. And I actually mean that in like a much more literal sense than people realize. And that, like letting go may actually turn out to be something like, oh yeah, like tone down the coupling coefficient between your vasculature and your nervous system. And eventually I do think like, yeah, we will be able to like, well, again, I'm an epistemological optimist, right? Like I'm very optimistic about this, but I do think we will be able to essentially in a few years have this gigantic table where like you describe any emotion you want, and we might be able to like A, like visualize it, and B, like provide like insightful commentary into like, hey, what is actually going on in your body and why when you're experiencing this emotion. Yeah.
And then new question. What is the methodology on is it MRI? Are you measuring?
Yeah.
Like, I'm curious. Just
I mean, we're very interdisciplinary. The main thing I would say that like distinguishes us is like, I mean, at least one of our mottos is like, taking phenomenology seriously. So and this is actually kind of like what I would describe as like the low-hanging fruit in a lot of like neuroscience and psychology research, which is that people are like, I think, like needlessly skeptical of people's self-reports. So indeed, the extreme example was like behaviorism, but like even if you go to like the Stanford psychology department and you say like, okay, like how do you find the signatures of happiness in the brain or something like that, they will give you a methodology where like, okay, yeah, you induce the state of happiness in somebody, you put them in an fMRI, and then you ask them to fill out a survey to like quantify how intense their happiness is. You shouldn't just kind of like take their self-reports at face value. You should always use kind of like these like validated, pre-established, factorizable surveys. Actually, the approach that we have is much more like, no, let's actually like really take seriously the descriptions of people, and like really accept the possibility that some people are actually like really talented at describing their experience at a very high level of granularity. And the reason why like the science of kind of subjectivity has been held back is because the way in which the habits by which we try to describe our experiences are just not the type of descriptions that are like actually helpful for doing science. Like the problem is not self-reports. The problem is the frameworks that we use for self-report. And in here, like as was describing, one of the examples was, you could describe like a DMT experience in terms of semantics to say like, well, I went to a world where I saw a bunch of clowns and they were like, waving. Very different is to say, hey, I went to a state of consciousness where there were, square tessellations and they were vibrating at 20 hertz and they were like synchronizing with this clustering coefficient. And like, when you're starting to describe experience, with that level of granularity, we think we're actually tapping into something like, okay, like what is the dynamic system that is implementing the experience? And so, to answer your question very straightforwardly, the methodology with this particular tool, it is, for example, we might like ask somebody to like recall a really beautiful memory, or like having them go like through a very 5-minute meditation experience, and then like to really tune into their experience, and we prompt them by saying things such as, okay, but like really notice not what this experience is about, but actually like what does it feel like? Like are there like pulsing sensations? Are there like waves traveling your body? Do you feel like you're kind of like expanding and contracting? And then like once you can kind of describe your experience in those terms, then we show you like 20 of these different animations, and we say like, okay, which of these like best describes or best kind of like matches or resonates with what you're actually experiencing. Now, of course, there's like all kinds of critiques that one can make about kind of this sort of epistemology, but like what I find is like, hey, actually people's reports do converge quite a lot, and I feel like it really is the case that just like science has like just not taking advantage of kind of like using like high quality phenomenology. It's like we're just like so distrustful of people's reports that like we throw the baby with the bathwater. Yeah. But yeah, just like the final thing is like, yeah, we also do like neuroimaging analysis, like EEG analysis, fMRI analysis, but it's so far at Curie has been like secondary, and partly is because we're a small institute, and our main kind of like contribution is really just like, hey, what happens when you take phenomenology seriously? Cool. Yes.
Hi. Thank you guys both for your talks.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you, Andres, about something that came to my mind while Wystan was responding to a different question, because you said something to the effect of like, these are already awakened states that are like in a sexual union together, and that's beautiful. But I wanted to ask you, Andres, about this is like somewhat of a deep cut, but your Demystify Sci podcast with Ogi Ogas.
Yes.
Where he talked about the axiomatized minds.
Yes.
And his sort of experience with that. Sounds very similar to me in a sense, where it's like these minds become like so internally coherent that they sort of vanish to a point, as you would say, and then they can sort of like re-emerge at will if they so choose, but like there is, I guess, like maybe some kind of like Markov blanket around them that like statistically sort of like I guess like smooths out anything that would otherwise permeate their boundary. I don't know if I'm like getting this across at all, but like
I'm not sure what you're asking.
The way
Yes.
that Wystan was talking about that earlier just sounded very similar to the way that the axiomatized minds were described, in the sense that like they reach this level where they sort of just become integrated into the physics, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, it may be, I guess a little bit of context there. Ogi Ogas is this, like a neuroscientist. He used to work at MIT for a while, and he's done like research in like autism and also in porn and human sexuality. He's famous for being like the first being part of the first team that did like a big data analysis on like porn search queries, and like how many hours of different types of porn different people watch, to kind of like as a window into like, okay, like what actually is like the underlying structure of people's sexuality. And there's like a lot of like he wrote a book called A Billion Wicked Thoughts, which is like a fascinating kind of account to follow this research. But he's like 55 years old now, and just a couple of years ago he came out as kind of like describing that he has, according to himself, been talking to alien superintelligences for the last 30 years of his life, which is kind of like unusual because
3 or 30?
30. So 3 years ago he kind of like started to talk about this publicly. He didn't talk about it publicly for a very long time because in his experience, anytime he's like talked about this with like friends or family or coworkers, like things have gone like very poorly. Even like people have tried to like put him in a mental asylum, and they kicked him out of college because I don't know, he was like an undergraduate and he had like these experiences, and because of autism, like he thought like, oh, I should probably go to the dean of the university and tell him like, hey, like I've been talking to aliens and you should know about this. And like, anyway, like, yeah, they put him on a mental hospital for a while. And so, yeah, he went quiet about it. But these contacts have continued to accelerate. And like, it's very unclear what's happening with him. Like what's unusual is just like how kind of like rational and well put together his mind is, given like the extraordinarily weird claims that he makes. Personally, I do suspect there's like something kind of like hypomania in like his, at least like more recently, some of his like recent posts. And I had a conversation with him like 2 weeks ago, and like, I mean, I wouldn't say like he's having a psychotic break, but like he definitely felt kind of like really hyper energized and like hypomanic, and so I'm not entirely sure what's going on there. But yeah, he claims that he contacted these kind of like super intelligences, that he calls them like axiomatized minds. He says like the universe is made of kind of like this hierarchy of like different minds of different sizes that goes from like molecular minds to cellular minds to modular minds to the type of minds that we are, to minds of an entire planet and stuff like that. And that the axiomatized minds are like minds so big and powerful that they have actually reconfigured themselves to change the very laws of quantum mechanics and physics. So like they create kind of their own quantum universe, and with a specific purpose. And like, yeah, I don't know, there's a lot of lore involved in here. But yeah, I mean, more recently he's actually been saying that he's now like pretty much constantly talking to these intelligences, and he's like writing like 5 posts, 5 like Substack posts about this every day.
Do they seem to have extra intelligence in these posts, or like is there something of value coming out of them? It seems like it's only you can get through talking to them.
I'm not sure. I mean, like I wouldn't say that I read his posts as like really demonstrating contact with a super intelligence. I mean, maybe it's, but they are like interesting, like surprisingly coherent given like the topic. Yeah. So, but yeah, I would suspect there's a little bit of a difference though, because like, I mean, I guess like a cessation state, or like these like advanced states of concentration, I mean, it's more kind of like everything disappears, whereas Ogi Ogas is like talking about these like huge hive minds that are like the size of like gigantic planets, and I feel like there's like maybe a different type of direction.
Though in like Vajrayana practice, Tantrayana, the primary method that distinguishes Tantra, whether in Buddhism or in Hinduism, is kind of the use of these symbolic forms of deities that one imaginatively embodies, that one supplicates, that one has like builds a relationship with, that becomes more and more vivid over time. So having visions of entities like according to Dzogchen cosmology, which is an offshoot of the branch of within Vajrayana, like all of this, quite literally within Dzogchen cosmology, is like a fractal fragment of the cosmic Buddha Samantabhadra. that like we're kind of embedded within like an unimaginably vast scale of Buddha realms within Buddha realms within Buddha realms. And I mean, this straightforwardly, in my opinion, comes from very real visionary phenomenology. So regardless of the ontological status of I can assure you, those experiences. Yeah. Yeah.
I haven't experienced that in meditation alone, but yeah, like DMT experiences with like gigantic god-like fractal crystals and stuff. It's like very compelling experiences at the time, at least.
Or you'll see schematic representations of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and Dakas and Dakinis kind of permeating the body. Also, yeah, it gets weird.
Yeah, so I guess like in your framework, like evidence of like this actually being a separate mind would be like if it told you something that you're like, it gave me the solution to this formula that no one's ever solved, and I just went and put the thing in and it solved it, or something.
Yeah.
That would be like maybe a clue that it's something else, but then otherwise you can't really confirm.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of approaches. I mean, one of them is, okay, if it can tell you what the lottery tickets for tomorrow will be and it's successful, okay, like there's probably something there, especially if you repeat it a bunch of times. If you just got lucky, it's like, oh man, like you just messed up your epistemology. But I mean, other methods, like, I mean, one of the approaches that I use to kind of a reason to take very seriously, for example, like DMT hallucinations is not just like how weird they are or how intense they are, how pleasant they are, but like actually like in what way they're like computationally interesting. And in some of my videos and interviews and write-ups, I've talked about like some of the like truly unusual kind of like mathematical properties of some of these like states of consciousness where, for example, the way in which colors get painted in like very complex surfaces seem to be done at a speed and accuracy that I find like really surprising for like my brain being able to do that. Now, we eventually should actually kind of like really formalize this and say like, okay, but what is the actual runtime complexity of this algorithm, and can we actually demonstrate with a computerized test that like being on DMT can actually allow you to like paint a surface like faster and more accurately than you could otherwise? That data just doesn't exist right now. All I can say is that I can definitely vouch for the very exotic computational power of some of these like states of consciousness. And yeah, I mean, in the case of Ogi Ogas, like the main thing that he says is that thanks to communicating with these entities, he now knows like the solution to the hard problem of consciousness, and he also lists a bunch of things that he claims to have like solved and understood. Then again, when I asked him for the solution, I don't find his explanation compelling. So like at least I'm not convinced personally. Yeah. Yes.
Just to follow up to what you were saying about like representing these phenomena.
Yeah.
Is it possible that our computers, as of now, they're not quantum computers, and maybe they're not capable of like more complex phenomena, like representing it or like sensing it?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like precisely. I mean, like one of the things that I think is going to be apparent, let's say in the next like 5-10 years, is the way in which like brain organoids. Brain organoids. For those who don't know, it's like there's this the new area of research where people are cultivating like tiny brains in petri dish essentially, or like various like enriched growth media, and they're actually starting to use them as part of like computational pipelines. You can train one of these like brain organoids to like play Pong. Now, there's like ethical concerns here because like maybe actually you're like using like a fragment of the fractal Buddha, or you're using a fragment of consciousness for like doing something trivial. For better or worse, probably this research will continue. There's a lot of like ethical considerations we have to like talk about, and like how to prevent kind of like a new factory farm scenario with brain organoids. But it is very much the case that like people are like wondering like, hey, why are these brain organoids actually like so efficient, in the sense of like, well, they don't use a lot of like power, but they're still able to do like what a computer would be able to do with like much more electricity. And my prediction is that in the next 5 or 10 years, we will find like really, really solid evidence that like a brain organoid with like n neurons can accomplish what with an artificial neural network you can only accomplish with, let's say, like 10,000 n neurons. And like once that gets like both theoretically and empirically established, I think it's going to be like
closing in 15 minutes.
Okay, yeah. It's going to be like super powerful evidence that like, hey, actually the brain is providing some substrate for compute that is not just neurons as we understand them. And that's another like mechanism. Yeah.
Those tubes that you hear about.
Yeah, I mean
Microtubules.
Yes. It's a world out there. It's a very Any other questions, comments? Yeah.
I said, quick question. So that you mentioned that there's like lots of different prompts that constrain your model of reality.
Yes.
What are you doing to ensure that your model is not just another one of these frames which may not actually match reality? Like, how do you approach the epistemology of it?
Yeah. No, that's a really great point. I mean, I think there's like some aspects of that can be answered in terms of kind of like orientation and like approaches for like how to approach truth. I mean, part of it is kind of like more your personal relationship with truth. I mean, like I guess like some people ask me like, okay, like why, how is it the case that I've had like over like 1,000 DMT and 1,000 like 5-MeO DMT experiences. Like, how is the case like I'm not crazy? Like I'm not in the streets and saying like, oh, the alien invasion is coming, or like the sort of thing that does tend to happen if you do these drugs a lot. And one of the reasons I would argue is because my self-image is actually not that of kind of like a messiah or like a prophet or like a shaman or anything like that. Personally, I identify more as a philosopher. Like the thing that I really care about is like, okay, like what is actually the true nature of reality, and I'm like radically open to like what it could potentially be. And I actually kind of like expect it is going to be like really surprising, and it's going to like kind of like break our pre-existing models, and that has happened like again and again and again. I find that to some extent, some of the things that make kind of like more narrow conceptions of reality kind of like latch on to people is because it latches onto their sense of self and like the way in which they have kind of like crafted a persona around it. I mean, of course, if you're a priest, like your whole social persona and sense of who you are is attached to like, some beliefs about like the truth of the Bible. And like, that's going to be really constraining. And the same if you're like a physicist, a biologist or something like that. If you identify as kind of like radically philosophical, just like trying to figure out the truth, that's like, it lessens a little bit like the effect of these constraints. And then another thing too is just like experimental methods, right? Like for example, the ways in which we have been able to like discover some of these like dynamics in consciousness, and for example, like have models for how like mushrooms work, how ayahuasca works, and 5-MeO works. It actually wasn't through like hypothesizing a particular mechanism and then like making experiments to test that. The way in which we arrive at this was with a very different methodology, something that I don't think is actually being done in like academia or like pretty much anywhere else, is an approach that we call the Museum of Consciousness approach. So for context, we would hold these legal psychedelic retreats. For example, in Brazil, we would bring like physicists, mathematicians, meditators like Wystan and advanced, and visual artists to work together as a team for like several weeks as kind of like a think tank or as a startup. And like, yes, there's some specific tests that are of the, okay, like, can we falsify these hypotheses? But like most of what we did was create a lot of like really interesting inputs and stimuli. And then when we are like in the, proper level of a given state of consciousness, we kind of like walk around and we interact with a bunch of computers, each of those kind of like having a different experiment. And essentially the prompt here is not, hey, like try to falsify this idea or try to like prove this idea. Is more like interact with these systems and just like tell us which ones look different than normal and weird. Right? It's more kind of like an algorithm for like anomaly detection. It's like, in what way is this like challenging your preconceptions and like it's giving you something surprising without having any kind of a preconceived notion of like what is it that we're going to learn. And I think like also that as a kind of like a research aesthetic also is like very protective. Also, yeah, I mean, some like meditation teachers also like they emphasize like for a lot of meditation practices, like one of the very kind of like wholesome approaches that you can have is like to go to a retreat without an expectation about like what's going to happen, right? It's like, okay, you're like radically open about like what is actually going to unfold. And also, yeah, I think like that vibes well with, yeah, like, hey, like find the needle in the haystack of like the things that are like really weird and challenges your conceptions. Yeah. Yeah, that's just what comes to mind, but yeah, yeah, so go ahead.
I was wondering if there's any utility that you found in demarcating like a pre-verbal experience from a verbal experience. This idea that like the way I communicate with someone through language might be different from the way like a mother communicates or expresses an emotional experience to her child or something. Those might be like different ways of interacting it. And also I was kind of wondering if from a spiritual perspective, whether there's a sense that like you have to attain a certain amount of like growing up in the world in order to attain enlightenment, or is it like children also have the potential to reach spiritual planes? Or I guess, yeah, that's kind of a question for you guys.
So yeah, important to demarcate from a like practice perspective, verbal and pre-verbal experience, and where the liberation occurs is well down the stack from verbal fabrication. You're kind of getting as close to the as close to the bone as possible. If you're gonna organize hierarchically the level of constructedness of experience up from some, imagined base, then verbal fabrication and conceptual thought, it's pretty high up there. And a lot of practice is actually tuning in and reducing the proliferation and elaboration upon kind of base layer sensory experience. So, yeah, there's a reason meditation retreats are usually silent.
Is there a historical record of the youngest person who's
Yeah, I can't call to mind, but monastics who are quite young. Yeah,
What is quite young,
like teens.
Teens.
Yeah, not. I don't know of any.
I mean, I'm from a Hindu background, and in our culture, they talk about like children who are maybe 10 years old could have those experiences. I don't know.
Yeah, it's also the case. Like I didn't actually recall these memories until I started meditating quite a lot, but I can recall now like incidences in childhood of having states that took me many thousands of hours to train back to be able to experience. Like as I remember as a kid, during car rides, I would be bored and I was like, this is scenery. But I would just lean over and kind of like I would imagine myself like falling backwards. But not hitting anything, and I could relax my body so completely and kind of just fall backwards through the car, so that I ended up like floating in a bodiless state, really disconnected from outer external sensory stimulation, and it was a great way to pass the time in a car ride. As an adult, that took a lot of deliberate training to replicate what I was able to do intuitively when I was 5. So.
I have a really similar experience to that. I just wanted to say that I have one specific memory that I've been trying really hard not to forget for that reason.
Yeah.
Like very similar.
Yeah, no, it's much more common, I think, than is reported, certainly, or than many people would think, that children are routinely able to have they're much more malleable phenomenologically. And yeah, I can think of many of my friends, teachers, colleagues who report similarly to me, like, oh, like, that? Oh yeah, I experienced that when I was 3 or 4.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what comment on the first component? I mean, of course, like verbally naming an aspect of your experience, like dramatically modifies it and like constrains it and reifies. It kind of like actually condenses a certain representation and makes it more stable. But that doesn't mean that like not naming things in your experience means that you're experiencing things kind of like in a raw way, right? Like some people in meditation, Robert Bay actually complains about this, that like
rightly so.
yeah. People say like, oh, if you could only shut down your inner dialogue, right? Like that is what awakening means, right? Like to just have like a silent
Empty
mind.
mind.
Empty mind. They also call it like bare perception, right?
Bare attention.
Bare attention. Yes.
Or I mean, lots of variants.
But yeah, like. What is it like? I start examining, more carefully. You realize, like, I mean, there really isn't something kind of like bare attention. Like, I mean, except like maybe like super rarefied states of consciousness, like the seventh jhana. Maybe you could kind of like
no.
Okay. but I'll give you an example. Like, even if you go to like a modern art museum and you see like a painting, and the painting has just like one line, right? Like you may think like, okay, that is just a few pixels in my visual field, right? Like, but actually like the way and the texture, and the sensitivity with which you approach that experience will allow like very, very different things to unfold. And if you sensitize yourself, especially to something kind of like in which Buddhist realm you find yourself in, you will realize that like the flavor of just how even you perceive that one line is completely dependent on a lot of things that you have been experiencing for like a long while, and like your current mood and previous conditions, where if you're like subtly in a Titan realm, you feel like you're in competition with everybody and you're trying to be the best. You look at that painting, and maybe actually like even pre-verbally, like the whole vibe is like, oh, I could have done that, right? Like, or like really they're like displaying this, like this is like the work of a child, like. All of those kind of like, imports and bias are like present in what would be like, bare, like this bare attention, which is like actually not bare at all. It's like really furbished with a lot of like vibes and imports. And I think like, yeah, it actually takes quite a bit of deconstruction to kind of like actually peel off the layers. Yeah, or like, yeah, you know, if you're in the, yeah, in the human realm, the way you might approach that is like very, very different. It's like, oh, like I want to understand like the materials with which that is made. Or like if you're in the, yeah, the heavenly realm is like, oh, like a shape. It's so beautiful. It's like, and yeah, you don't know in which realm you are until you're kind of like actually exploring the realms and like developing sensitivity for those like nuances. Yeah. The other thing too, like I guess like I'll add also is like the quality of attention is another very, very, very big factor, because I mean, naively, we think of our experiences, okay, there's like a canvas, there's like a visual field in front of us. But hey, actually, like the way in which you approach your visual field has a lot of like subtle parameters that we may not be, we don't necessarily have words for. Things such as, am I trying to kind of like cling to the patterns in the visual field? Am I trying to like make sense of them? Am I trying to reify them? Or for example, do I perceive myself as here looking at the pattern? Or do I experience myself as the entire screen? Or do I experience my sense of self as embedded in the image? And all of those are different like subtle variations in like how attention like and its dynamics work. Meaning that there's like so many more parameters that are like, even just before you add kind of like any kind of like verbalization, already condition your experience in dramatic ways. Yeah. All right, I guess like we have time for one more question or one more comment, and okay, maybe you haven't, yeah.
Yeah, what does success look like for your organization?
Oh, for my organization, I thought you were going to say success in terms of enlightenment, but success.
That one I have other reports on.
Right. Success on the organization. I mean, like, I don't think there's really like any ceiling here, because, I mean, well, okay, like the full success is like, okay, like full enlightenment for all sentient beings, just zero suffering from now on, complete understanding of the state space of consciousness, availability of any state space of consciousness, at once with a click of a button, a full correspondence between our formal mathematical models of reality and phenomenology, super free will, the ability to have enormous amounts of energy. Yeah, I guess like to name a few. No, but I guess like, yeah, more realistically though, like the things that I think I can actually like move the needle in my life with kind of like the sort of people that I collaborate with and the people in the space. I do think actually I am very ambitious, and I think like we can actually have like quite an enormous impact. And it might look like as follows, which is that let's say like accelerating the elimination of cluster headaches by 5 years or something like that, which I think they will be eliminated regardless, but like how fast that happens depends on like, hey, can we actually do the right political moves and the right like fundraising moves to actually like move the needle in that direction. Then also like technologies that will accelerate, for example, being able to experience the jhanas, taking you from, let's say, like 600 hours of practice to maybe like 100 hours of practice. Like I think like maybe that is realistic with the right kind of like setup of like biofeedback and the proper pharmacological interventions. And also, yeah, like very concretely, I do think we are like positioned in a way that will allow us to be able to like drastically accelerate like the diagnosis of like painful conditions, so that like we don't rely on like, yeah, the doctor's interpretation or like, people's response on a survey, but actually like visualizations of pain and pleasure, and being able to, yeah, for example, rather than having to shop, doctors over the course of 5 years, so you get a diagnosis of fibromyalgia, you might be able to, log onto a website and in a matter of like 1 hour actually have like a really precise diagnostic of actually what's happening, and also have like a therapy that will like specifically be able to disrupt the kind of like internal chaos and disharmony that is producing the negative valence. I think like, yeah, those are kind of like the ambitious but maybe achievable goals.
So what I'm hearing is like use the framework of Kanta, Dukkha, etc., and then bring it into the bottom realm of science, technology, and then create new interventions that are coherent within the framework of Kanta, Dukkha.
Actually, I would say it's more like bringing the framework of actually what we call qualia formalism, which is that, the idea that every moment of experience corresponds to a mathematical object, and like, consciousness will be understood.
The Commons is now closed. Please pack up your belongings and have a great night.
All right, I'll just finish this sentence. Yeah, like using essentially the the thing that allows us to understand the physical world in terms of like math, essentially like physics, but applying it to consciousness and reframing, all of the vocabulary and conceptual frameworks that Buddhism has been working with, but through this new framework. That is essentially what we're doing. Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you everybody. Appreciate it. Yay.